Why are you standing there?
I have something to say.
Can't it wait?
No, it's important.
You have until the end of this month. Bring me news of an engagement, or I will restructure the entire organization and hand operational authority to the council.
I'm not marrying her.
Then you have until the end of the month to change your mind. Stubbornness runs in his blood.
But as the pressure around him tightened and the deadline grew closer, Joon-Seo realized that power alone could not solve every problem. And before the month was over, one unexpected decision would pull him into a situation. Hi besties, welcome back to AfroSeoul Desires. Do well to subscribe, like, and drop your thoughts in the comments as we go. The thing about Kwon Tower was that it ran like a machine. 800 employees, 6 floors of legitimate business operations, and one man at the top who communicated primarily through single-word replies and pointed silences. The staff had developed an entire unspoken language around his moods. The way he held his coffee cup meant one thing. The particular angle of his jaw when he read reports meant something else entirely. New employees learned it within 2 weeks, or they didn't last long enough to need to. Zara Thompson had been in Seoul for 4 months. She had come from Washington, D.C., with a communications degree, a work visa, and the stubborn belief that she could carve out something real for herself in a city she barely knew. Her Korean was functional, improving daily, and her professional record was clean. What she had not expected was that half the corporate offices in Seoul would look at her resume, then look at her, then find politely worded reasons not to call back. Her mother's medical bills were not politely worded. They were extremely direct. She had 2 jobs during those months. A morning shift doing content work for a small English-language media company, and evenings tutoring business Korean to expats who were discovering, as she had, that Google Translate was not a sufficient substitute for actually knowing the language. Between the two she was surviving, which was not the same thing as living, and she knew the difference because she had done both before, and this was definitively the former. Zara Thompson was not a woman who complained easily, or answering for herself as a general posture, and some nights she sat on her window ledge and looked out at Seoul, glittering in every direction, and thought, very plainly, that something needed to change. So when a recruiter contacted her about a communications coordinator role at Kwon Group's public relations division, she said yes before the woman finished the sentence. She arrived at Kwon Tower 7 minutes early, because she was always 7 minutes early, wearing a gray blazer and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how competent she was. Her cat-shaped eyes swept the lobby once, catalogued it, and moved on, marble everywhere. High ceilings, men in suits moving with purpose. A receptionist who looked at her badge, then at her face, then printed her visitor pass without comment. She did not know, as she stepped into the elevator, that the man who owned this building had spent the previous night making a decision. Joon-Seo was not a man who explained himself. When Lee Tae-yoon, his best friend and second in the organization, had asked him that morning why he was personally sitting in on a routine HR interview, Joon-Seo had said simply that he had business on that floor. Tae-yoon had smiled the warm, easy smile that had made him beloved by nearly everyone in their orbit, and let it go. Tae-yoon was good at letting things go. 31. Charming in a way that felt entirely effortless, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once. He had been Joon-Seo's closest friend since they were teenagers, had stood beside him through every dangerous thing the organization had demanded, and had never once appeared to want anything more than what he had. That was what everyone believed, including Joon-Seo. Tae-yoon was the kind of person who made you forget to be careful. That was his real gift, and the most dangerous thing about him. He was so genuinely good at warmth, so fluent in making people feel seen and at ease, that you never thought to look underneath it. Why would you? The warmth was real. The attention was real. That was the thing that made what came later so complicated to process, because you couldn't simply decide it had all been performance. Parts of it had been completely true. That was the architecture of it. Real warmth and real affection doing the work of concealing the older wound. The thing that had been sitting underneath for years, building pressure in a way even he probably didn't fully understand until it was too late to choose differently. But none of that was visible yet. The interview itself was unremarkable until it wasn't. Zara walked in, took her seat, pulled out a tablet with her portfolio already open, and began talking before the interviewer had finished her introduction sentence. Not rudely, just efficiently. She had clearly decided that the most respectful thing she could do with everyone's time was to be very good at explaining exactly what she brought to the table. Joon-Seo was standing near the back wall where no one had thought to introduce him. She had been speaking for about 90 seconds when she glanced up and noticed him. Most people, noticing Kwon Joon-Seo in a room they hadn't expected him to be in, did a particular kind of thing with their faces. Something between panic and recalibration. Zara Thompson frowned slightly, then looked back at the interviewer. Is there a reason someone's standing back there, or should I continue? The interviewer went pale. Joon-Seo almost smiled. Almost. Continue, he said. She did. Afterward, when the interviewer had found a reason to step out and it was just the two of them in the small conference room, Joon-Seo sat down across from her for the first time. She didn't fidget. She waited. I have a different position in mind for you. What kind of position? Temporary. 6 months. Significant compensation. I need details before I agree to anything. It involves attending social events, living in my residence, and performing the role of my fiancée, convincingly enough to satisfy my grandmother, and delay an arranged marriage I have no intention of going through with. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Zara laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face entirely. You cannot be serious. The compensation is 90 million won for the full term. You would maintain your own private space within the residence. There would be a contract. No ambiguity. The laugh faded as she registered that no one else in the room was finding this funny. That's your actual offer. It is. She looked at him for a long moment with those sharp, direct eyes. Why me? You don't know me. I know you arrived 7 minutes early to an interview in a building you'd never been to. I know you spoke directly to the point without performance. I know you noticed something was unusual in the room and asked about it instead of pretending it wasn't there. He stood. I need someone who doesn't rattle easily. The contract will be on your phone within the hour. He walked to the door, then stopped without turning around. Your mother is at Severance Hospital. The billing department there is very accommodating when accounts are settled in full. He left. Zara sat alone in the conference room for a full minute. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her blazer, and thought very carefully about what she was about to do. She accepted the contract at 11:47 that morning. Moving into the Kwon residence in Hanam-dong was an experience Zara would later describe to absolutely no one as living inside a very beautiful, very tense museum where one of the exhibits was occasionally hostile. The house itself was extraordinary. 4 floors, a private garden, staff quarters, a kitchen that could have catered a state dinner. Her room was larger than her entire apartment had been. She was shown to it by a housekeeper named Mrs. O, who was in her 50s, kind-eyed, and communicated almost entirely through significant looks and small gestures that Zara spent the first 2 weeks decoding. Joon-Seo had given her a folder on their first full day at the residence. It contained a cover story, a timeline of their supposed relationship, key details about his family that he needed her to know, and a list of upcoming events where her presence would be required. At the bottom of the last page, in his handwriting rather than typed, "Do not tell my grandmother anything she does not already believe. She will test everything." Zara read it twice, wrote 3 clarifying questions in the margin, and slid it back under his study door. He answered all 3 questions in writing within 20 minutes. That was how they communicated for the first week. Notes, documents, occasional brief exchanges in the hallway that lasted no longer than necessary. He was not rude, exactly. He was simply extremely economical. Words were tools, and he used exactly as many as the job required. She studied the cover story with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she cared about doing well. She annotated the margins. She added 2 details of her own that she thought made it more believable and sent them back through Mrs. O. He incorporated both without comment. She found that somehow reassuring. He cared about doing this correctly. That was something she could work with. The staff had a particular way of moving around the house that told her things Joon-Seo never would. Mrs. O moved through his space with a carefulness that was not fear, but something more like respect for a very precise system. The security staff, 4 of them rotating in shifts, had the quiet competence of people who understood the difference between threat levels in a very lived, practical way. This was not a normal household in the way that a hospital is not a normal building. It functioned completely. Everyone inside it knew their role. But underneath the ordinary rhythms of meals and deliveries and cleaned rooms was the constant low hum of something much larger being managed from inside these walls. She found it oddly not frightening. Her own life had required a specific kind of alertness for as long as she could remember. She knew how to read rooms, how to sense when the surface of a situation and the reality of it were 2 different things. This house asked her to do that same work at a larger scale. She was fine with that. What surprised her was the other thing. The morning after she arrived, she came down to the kitchen at 6:30 to make coffee and found a small card on the counter beside the machine. In Mrs. O's handwriting, but clearly at someone's instruction. There is kimchi jjigae in the fridge that has been made mild. The regular preparation is too spicy. She stood there holding the card for a moment. She had mentioned the spice issue exactly once, in passing, during their second conversation. 3 days later, it rained unexpectedly. She had left her umbrella in her room. When she got to the front door, there was an umbrella already there, leaning against the wall. Mrs. O was nowhere nearby. Joon-Seo's car was already gone. The gala was Zara's first real test, and Park Myung-ja arrived prepared for war. The old woman was formidable in a way that went beyond money or authority. She had a quality of absolute stillness that made everything around her seem slightly in motion by comparison. She assessed Zara in the first 30 seconds of meeting her with the particular efficiency of someone who had been reading people for decades and had very little patience for nonsense. Zara smiled, greeted her in Korean with an accent that was not perfect but was respectful, and then said something that no one in that room had expected. "Your garden at the family estate must be extraordinary this time of year. I saw the photographs from the spring opening. The peonies especially. The way they're arranged along the south wall suggests someone with a real understanding of how light changes across a day." Park Myung-ja was quiet for a moment. "You know about gardens. My grandmother kept one. I spent a lot of time in it." The silence was different after that. Not warm, not yet, but something had shifted. Soo-jin, watching from across the room in a gown that cost more than most people's annual salaries, smiled the smile of someone recalculating. Choi Soo-jin was not stupid. That was important to understand. She was calculating and territorial and had a particular talent for making other women feel out of place without ever doing anything overtly cruel enough to be called out on. She found Zara within 20 minutes of the introductions and positioned herself at exactly the right angle to make the conversation feel like a kindness rather than an assessment. "You must find Seoul quite different from what you're used to," she offered in English. "Every city is different from what you're used to," Zara replied smoothly, staying in Korean. "That's the point of moving to a new one." Soo-jin's smile held. "Of course." Her eyes moved toward where Joon-Seo was standing across the room. "He can be very difficult to read." "I don't find him difficult. Give it time." Zara looked at her with those direct cat eyes and said pleasantly, "I appreciate the advice." Then she walked back toward Joon-Seo and touched his arm lightly, then leaned in to tell him something about the event program. She felt him go very slightly still at the contact before he adjusted, naturally, and bent his head to listen. Across the room, Park Myung-ja watched all of this over the rim of her tea glass. Later, during the dinner portion of the evening, Zara noticed that the fish course had been placed in front of Joon-Seo. He hadn't touched it. She leaned close and said quietly, "Do you want me to flag a server?" "I'm fine. The sauce has shellfish in it. I can see it from here. I wasn't going to eat it. I know. I just wanted to make sure you knew why." She had already signaled the server with the slightest lift of her hand. The plate was replaced before anyone else at the table noticed anything had happened. Park Myung-ja, seated 3 chairs down, watched the server take the plate, watched Zara turn back to her conversation without any performance of the gesture, watched her grandson's expression in the half-second before he rearranged it. She said nothing, but she looked, for the first time that evening, like she was genuinely thinking. She began to pay attention differently after that. Lee Tae-yun came by the residence on a Thursday evening, and Zara's entire understanding of the house's atmosphere shifted the moment he walked in. It was like watching a window get opened in a room that had been closed all winter. He shook hands with Mrs. O and actually asked how her knee was doing. He greeted the security staff by name. When he found Zara sitting in the garden reading through a communications brief, he dropped into the chair across from her without ceremony, picked up a grape from the fruit plate she'd brought out, and introduced himself like they'd been friends for years. "Zara Thompson. I've heard approximately nothing about you from Joon-Seo, which actually tells me everything." He grinned. It was a genuinely warm grin. He only goes quiet about things that actually matter to him. He goes quiet about most things. Fair, he does. But there are different kinds of quiet. You'll learn to tell them apart. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since arriving. Tae-yun had a gift for making people feel like the most natural thing in the world was to just keep talking. He asked about her work background without it feeling like an interview. He told a story about Joon-Seo from when they were 17 that made her genuinely laugh. He refilled her water glass without being asked because he happened to be reaching past it. When Joon-Seo came home that evening and found them in the garden, he stopped in the doorway for a moment. Just a moment. His eyes moved between them, something passing through his expression too quickly to read. And then he walked in and told Tae-hyun he was staying for dinner in a tone that made it sound like he had always planned to say that. Tae-hyun was already leaning back, like he'd been invited hours ago. Obviously. Over the weeks that followed, Tae-hyun became a regular presence. He had a way of making the residents feel lighter. He taught Zara which delivery places were actually good versus which ones just had better apps. He brought her a rain jacket with a Seoul transit map, printed on the inside as a joke when she mentioned getting lost twice in 1 week, and she genuinely loved it and wore it, and he looked so pleased about that she felt something warm she quickly decided not to examine. The one that had lodged somewhere most specifically in her memory was the night she was sick. It was week 4, and she had come down with a proper cold of the grinding head-stuffed, everything is terrible variety. She had taken medicine and gone to bed at 8, and was emphatically not thinking about anything related to the arrangement, or the organization, or the work she was supposed to be doing the next morning. She was thinking about being miserable and trying to sleep. At around 2 in the morning, she became aware of a light under her door. Not the hallway light. Lower than that. She lay there for a moment trying to decide if she cared enough to investigate, and then curiosity won because it always did. She opened the door. Joon-Seo was sitting in the hallway, on one of the chairs that was usually against the far wall, which meant he had moved it, which meant he had been there for some time. He had his phone and a document in his lap. He looked up when the door opened. "You should be asleep." "So should you." She looked at the chair, at the document, at the general fact of him in her hallway at 2 in the morning. "Is there something wrong with the organization?" "No." "Then why are you sitting outside my room?" He was quiet for a moment. "You had a fever earlier," Mrs. O checked. "I wanted to be nearby in case it got worse." Zara stood in her doorway with her head full of cold medicine, and looked at this man who controlled most of Seoul's waterfront infrastructure, sitting in a hallway chair outside her room like a very well-dressed hall monitor, and felt something in her chest do a complicated thing that she did not have the energy to properly examine. "It's not worse," she said. "Good." He looked back at his document. "Go back to sleep." She went back to sleep. In the morning she felt better and neither of them mentioned it, and she added it to the count. It was a Saturday night in the 5th week when things went sideways in a way nobody named out loud. Tae-hyun had stayed for dinner again, which had become normal enough that Mrs. O simply set 3 places without being asked. The food was good, the conversation was easy, and afterward the 3 of them ended up in the sitting room with tea while the rain came down hard outside. Tae-hyun was in the middle of a story about a client meeting that had gone spectacularly wrong in a Busan hotel, and Zara was laughing freely, the kind of laugh that required both hands, and Tae-hyun was laughing too, pleased with himself, turning toward her to finish the punchline. Joon-Seo was looking at the rain. He had stopped listening to the story approximately 3 minutes earlier, somewhere around the point where Zara had pulled her knees up onto the sofa, and Tae-hyun had shifted his body to face her more directly. Joon-Seo's tea had gone cold without him noticing. His right hand, resting on the arm of his chair, had closed around the fabric without him noticing that either. When Zara laughed at the punchline, Tae-hyun reached over and touched her arm briefly, a punctuation to the joke, completely natural. She didn't pull away. She was still laughing. Joon-Seo set his cold tea down on the side table, stood, and said he had documents to finish before Monday. Both of them looked up. "It's Saturday," Tae-hyun said. "I know what day it is." He walked out of the room. In the hallway, he stood very still for a moment outside the sitting room door, the sound of their resumed conversation coming through it. And then he went upstairs and did not, in fact, look at a single document. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the rain, and thought about nothing in particular with great intensity until well past midnight. The next morning, Zara appeared in his study with coffee, which was not unusual, but this time she sat down across from him, and looked at him with the particular direct attention he had come to understand meant she had decided to say something. "You've been short with Tae-hyun the past few days." "I'm short with everyone. With everyone else it's normal. With him it's different." She wrapped both hands around her own coffee. "He's noticed. He hasn't said anything, but he has." "Did he send you in here?" "Obviously not. I'm asking because I live in this house, and the atmosphere is starting to feel like before a storm, and I'd prefer to know what I'm walking into." The bluntness of it caught him somewhere unexpected. He had spent years surrounded by people who softened things, who approached things diagonally, who never said the direct version of what they meant. She just said it. "It's nothing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she finished her coffee and stood. At the door she stopped, not turning around. "For what it's worth, I think you're the most honest person in this arrangement. You told me exactly what this was from the beginning. That's not nothing." She was gone before he could figure out what to do with that. What neither Zara nor Joon-Seo knew was that Tae-hyun had a meeting the previous month that had nothing to do with organization business. The Kwon organization had 3 major rivals. One of them, a man named Director Shin, had been trying for 2 years to find leverage on Joon-Seo that was human rather than structural. Financial pressure hadn't worked. Legal maneuvering hadn't worked. Joon-Seo was simply too careful, too thorough, too many steps ahead. What Director Shin had was a proposal, and Lee Tae-hyun, who had spent 15 years standing beside the most powerful man in the room while everyone looked past him, had listened to that proposal for longer than a loyal man should have. Tae-hyun had always been good at compartmentalizing. He could feel things completely and still function as though he didn't. He genuinely cared about Zara. He also, in a separate compartment, had agreed to provide Director Shin with internal organization routing information that would unravel the Kwon network from 3 different directions simultaneously once the deal was executed. These 2 things lived side by side inside him, and he was very careful not to let them look at each other. What he had not calculated for was Zara's insomnia. She had always been a light sleeper. 3 in the morning, and she was awake, which happened twice a week at minimum in a foreign city where her brain refused to fully trust the quiet. She had a routine for it. Tea, a walk through the lower floor, 40 minutes of reading. That particular night the light in the East Wing study was on when she passed it. Not Joon-Seo's study, which was in the main wing. The East Wing study was where Tae-hyun worked when he stayed over, which happened more often lately since he claimed the drive back was inconvenient. She almost kept walking. She genuinely almost did. But there was something in the quality of the silence coming from under that door. Not reading silence. Conversation silence, the kind where someone is being very careful about volume. She heard her name. Not clearly. Just the shape of it. Just enough. She stopped moving. She doesn't suspect anything. Tae-hyun's voice, quieter than she had ever heard it. The warmth entirely absent, replaced with something flat and transactional. The access she has to his schedule makes the timing straightforward. A voice from the phone said something she couldn't make out. The accounts in the Busan line are the entry point. Once Shin's people are in, the cascade takes about 72 hours. Joon-Seo won't have time to counteract all three simultaneously. The organization folds to Shin's structure by the following week. The phone voice said something again. Zara. He said her name the way you say the name of an ingredient in a recipe. She served her purpose. Once this is done, she's collateral, not a target, just irrelevant. The floor in the hallway was old hardwood, and it did not care about timing or dramatic appropriateness. It creaked. Inside the study, the conversation stopped. Zara had already taken 3 steps backward. The door opened. She was at the end of the hallway when Tae-hyun stepped out, and for one suspended moment they were both completely still. And she could see his face do something she had never seen it do before. The warmth came back, reflexively, and then dropped away again when he saw her expression. Zara, she ran. She made it outside before she fully understood that she had no phone, no wallet, no plan. She had grown up knowing how to keep herself calm in situations that would unravel most people. But nothing in her life had prepared her for this specific combination. A foreign city at 3 in the morning. A man she had trusted completely having just spoken about her, like an inconvenient piece of furniture, and the growing realization that her presence in this house had been used against the one person in it who had been, for all his coldness, entirely straight with her from the first conversation. She was 3 blocks from the residence when the cars appeared. 2 black vehicles, moving too deliberately to be coincidence, cutting off the end of the street ahead of her. Men getting out. Not police. Something else entirely. She backed up and the third car came from the other direction and stopped hard, and Joon-Seo stepped out into the street. His expression was not the controlled, managed blankness she was used to. It was something that had gotten past those controls. He looked at the men by the other cars and said nothing. He just looked at them. They got back in their vehicles and the vehicles left. He opened the car door. She got in. They drove for a while without speaking. Eventually, he pulled off the road near the Han River and cut the engine. The water moved outside, black and silver, and the city was loud and indifferent in the distance. His hands stayed on the steering wheel. He kept his eyes. I knew for 3 days. I suspected for 2 weeks before that. And you didn't tell me. No. Why not? He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the river. His knuckles were white on the wheel. When he finally spoke, each word had the careful quality of something being said that had been kept down for a long time. Because you smiled around him differently. You trusted him the way you don't trust people quickly. And I kept thinking if I said something and I was wrong, I would have taken that from you for nothing. The river moved. He still hadn't looked at her. I was afraid you'd choose him. Zara had been holding herself together with considerable effort for the past 40 minutes. She was not built for falling apart. But she sat with the full weight of what he'd just said and felt it settle somewhere that was going to take a long time to examine properly. I wouldn't have, she said finally. He turned to look at her for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. I know that now. What came next was not quiet or easy. Tae-hyun moved quickly once he knew she had heard. The information pipeline to Shin's people accelerated. 3 of Joon-Seo's senior lieutenants received anonymous intelligence that made them hesitate, which was all it took to create gaps. Business partners who had been reliable for a decade started to feel uncertain. 2 major contracts got quietly rerouted. The organization, which had run like a sealed clock for years, started making ticking sounds it shouldn't have been making. Joon-Seo worked 18-hour days. Zara, who the contract had never specified to stay involved in anything like this, stayed anyway. Not because of the contract. That had stopped being the operating agreement somewhere around week 5, without either of them officially acknowledging it. She stayed because she understood communications, which was what this actually was at its core. A war of information, of who believed what and when and based on whose account. She stayed because she was good at it. She stayed because she looked at him across the table at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents and the particular exhaustion of someone fighting on too many fronts at once. And she did not want to be anywhere else. Park Myung-ja arrived on a Tuesday morning without warning. Mrs. Oh met her at the door and brought her through to the main sitting room. And the old woman sat down and waited with the absolute patience of someone who had the time and the authority and the will. When Joon-Seo appeared, still in yesterday's shirt, having been awake for most of the past 36 hours, she looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down." He sat. "Tell me what's happening," he told her. All of it. The betrayal, the timeline, the damage already done, the damage they were working to prevent. He did not soften it, and she did not ask him to. When he finished, she was quiet for some time. Tae-hyun. She said the name like she was identifying a specific kind of wound. "I saw it wrong." "So did I." She looked toward the window. "Where is Zara?" "In the operations room. She's been helping manage the communications side." A silence. Then Park Myung-ja said something Joon-Seo had not heard her say in a very long time. "I was wrong about her." He waited. She didn't need the money badly enough to stay through this. She would have left with her contract payment and her mother's bills paid, and no one would have blamed her. She turned back to face him. But she stayed. She stayed. His grandmother looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has made many calculations in her life and is presently revising one of them. For a long time she said nothing more. Then, without ceremony, "Don't waste it." Soo-jin did not take the changed atmosphere gracefully. She had invested significant time and family resource into the assumption that the arrangement with Joon-Seo would eventually solidify. Whatever this Zara Thompson was, it would run its course. When it became clear that wasn't happening, she made 3 attempts to accelerate the inconvenience. The first was a rumor seeded into a business press contact about Zara's presence in the organization being a conflict of interest. It reached 2 outlets and was killed before it ran, because Joon-Seo found out about it in the time between the seed and the publication, and the conversation he had with Soo-jin's family's business representatives was short and extremely clear. The second was a social event where Soo-jin engineered a conversation in which Zara was publicly questioned about her credentials in a room full of people who mattered. Zara handled it the way she handled most things designed to destabilize her, which was by being so entirely calm and specific and unrattled that the people watching felt uncomfortable for Soo-jin rather than for Zara. At one point, with a pleasantness that had real steel underneath it. "I appreciate the thoroughness. It's always good to be asked directly." The third attempt never quite happened because Joon-Seo walked into the room while it was forming, looked at Soo-jin for about 4 seconds, and said simply, "If there is a 4th time, your family's partnership with Shin's network becomes public information. I have documentation." He was not angry when he said this, he was matter of fact. "I suggest we don't need a 4th time." Soo-jin left shortly after. Park Myung-ja, who had been in the adjacent room and almost certainly heard all of this, walked in afterward and sat across from Zara without preamble. "I'd like to teach you how to arrange the orchids in the East Garden properly. The person I trusted with them didn't know what they were doing." Zara looked at her. "I'd like that." The old woman nodded once. It was not a warm moment exactly. It was something more durable than warm. It was the moment a door opens that has been closed a long time, and both of them understood what it meant. The grandmother's situation required more patience than almost anything else. Park Myung-ja was not a woman who changed her assessments quickly. She had spent 68 years forming opinions about people and being substantially correct, and she was disinclined to revise a position simply because circumstances invited it. Her initial reading of Zara had been unsuitable. Foreign, unknown family, arrived suddenly, probably temporary. She was not, she would never fully admit, used to being the one who had to do the updating. The gala had been the first crack, not the orchid compliment, which anyone could have rehearsed. The fish course, the way Zara had handled it, smooth and efficient and immediately forgettable. No drama, no pointed look at the grandmother to indicate she had just saved her grandson from a miserable evening in hospital. Just a quiet correction of a situation that needed correcting. Park Myung-ja had run this family for 40 years. She knew the difference between someone who performed helpfulness and someone who simply was helpful. And she knew which one was actually useful in the long run. The second thing was what Joon-Seo had done after Soo-jin's second attempt. Park Myung-ja had watched her grandson for 32 years. She had seen him angry, cold, in the controlled fury he deployed in professional conflict. She had never seen him look the way he looked when he understood Soo-jin had upset Zara. It was not fury. It was something quieter and considerably more absolute. The look of a decision already made and past the point of influence. She had thought about that look for several days, and then she had called Zara about the orchids. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Zara knew things about plants that Park Myung-ja's regular gardening staff did not know. Practical things, the kind of knowledge that comes from years of actual attention. They had disagreed twice, civilly, and both occasions turned out to have 2 partially correct answers. Park Myung-ja had found this entirely acceptable. She could not stand people who didn't push back. People who didn't push back were either stupid or dishonest, and she had no patience for either category. When Joon-Seo found out about this phone call from Mrs. O because Mrs. O told him everything relevant, he sat with the information for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, good. What she had not expected was the Tuesday evening, about 6 weeks into the recovery, when she was working late on a communications timeline in the dining room and Joon-Seo came downstairs, looked at the spread of her documents, sat down across from her, and said, tell me what you're thinking about the Incheon announcement. Not tell me your recommendation, not present your analysis. Tell me what you're thinking. Like they were 2 people thinking through the same problem together, which was exactly what they were, she told him. He pushed back on 2 points. She pushed back on his pushback. They found the right answer somewhere in the middle of an argument that never got unkind and lasted until midnight, at which point Mrs. O appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, looked at the 2 of them and the disaster of documents between them, shook her head with the precise energy of someone who had opinions about people who kept these hours, and put a plate of cut fruit on the table without comment before going back upstairs. Zara and Joon-Seo both looked at the fruit, then at each other. She does that, he said. I've noticed. Zara took a piece of apple. She also rearranges my bookshelf when she thinks I've been in a bad mood. I've decided to find it comforting rather than invasive. She rearranged mine when I was 17. I didn't speak to her for a week. Did it help the rearrange? Possibly. She looked at him across the table with all the documents between them and the late hour and the fruit plate, and the months of this shared life behind them, and thought very clearly that this was the part they weren't going to be able to keep calling an arrangement for much longer. She didn't say that, but she thought it completely and didn't put it away. The final move came on a Wednesday. Tae-hyun had been running out of time and he knew it. Joon-Seo had closed 2 of the 3 breach points. The third was viable for another 72 hours. And once it closed, everything Tae-hyun had set in motion would unravel without producing any of the promised damage. He would have betrayed his oldest friend for nothing. The arrangement with Shin would dissolve, the protections along with it, and Tae-hyun himself would be in a genuinely precarious position. He made the choice that people make when they have run out of good options. He called Zara on a number she recognized, with a voice she still instinctively trusted despite everything, and told her he needed her to understand, that he owed her that much. She almost didn't go. She thought about it for a long time. Then she thought about the fact that if she didn't, he might try something more drastic, and whatever happened in that warehouse would happen without Joon-Seo knowing where she was. She told Mrs. O before she left. Mrs. O told Joon-Seo within 30 seconds. The warehouse was in the industrial district east of the river, the kind of place where the geography itself felt like an argument for bad decisions. Taehyun was already there, and the men who closed the door behind her made it clear this was not about explaining anything. "You didn't have to do this," Zara said. He was standing near the far wall, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked actually tired. Not the performance of tiredness, the real thing. "I just needed a few more hours. Once the third breach executes, Joon-Seo has to negotiate. Shin agreed to keep me protected in the restructure. You honestly believe that? What choice do I have?" You could have told him. Any point along the way. He would have. You don't know what he would have done. Because you didn't try. She sat down on one of the warehouse's old chairs because her legs were tired, and she had decided not to give the setting the satisfaction of making her look afraid. You had 15 years of a man who trusted you completely, and you spent it calculating instead of talking to him. Taehyun was quiet. "Was any of it real?" she asked. Not angry, just asking. "You know it was. I know you believe that. But you also knew what you were doing when you used me." She looked at him steadily. "Both those things lived in you at the same time, and you let them." He didn't have an answer for that. The door opened, and Joon-Seo walked in alone. He looked at Zara first, a quick full assessment that confirmed she was physically fine. Then he looked at Taehyun, and the two men stood across from each other with 15 years between them and all the things that had accumulated inside that 15 years. "Tell me one honest thing." Taehyun's jaw worked for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. "You remember that night in Incheon years ago? The meeting where Shin's predecessor offered us both a buyout. You turned it down in about 10 seconds. You didn't even look at the number. I looked at the number. I thought about it for 3 days. And I never told you. Not because the money mattered, but because I realized that you would never have needed those 3 days. You just knew, and I didn't. That was the first time I understood that being beside you and being you were two completely different things." He looked at Zara. "Watching you become important to him was the last time I was willing to come in second." Joon-Seo was still for a long moment. "The third breach. Is it still active?" "For 40 minutes. Call it off, and I'll give you 48 hours to leave Seoul before any other decisions get made. That is the offer. It expires shortly." Taehyun looked at Zara. She looked back at him with real sadness, because the person she had thought he was had been real enough that losing it hurt. "I'm sorry," she said. "I genuinely am." Taehyun made the call. The weeks after were a particular kind of reconstruction. The organization stabilized. The Shin situation was contained through a combination of information Joon-Seo had held in reserve and a series of conversations with the council that made Shin's proposed restructure look considerably less attractive than it had. 2 of the wavering lieutenants came back. 1 didn't, and that was handled. Zara's contract had technically expired during all of this. Neither of them had mentioned it. She was in the garden one morning, second coffee, watching Mrs. O argue with the orchid arrangement in a way that suggested the orchids were losing, when Joon-Seo came out and sat across from her. Not across in the work sense. The other kind. He put something on the table between them, a document. It was a role description. Head of Communications, Kwon Group, permanent. She read through it the way she read everything, beginning to end without skipping, and he waited. When she looked up, she found him already watching her. "Your thoughts on the salary," he said. "It needs to go up. I expected that. There's a revised figure on the second page." She turned to it. The number was already higher than what she would have asked for. She looked at him. He looked back. She set the document down on the table. Mrs. O, who had been arguing with the same orchid branch for the past 4 minutes without making any progress, went very still. Zara reached across the table and tapped the document once, a small, decisive gesture, acceptance. Then she looked out at the garden, at the morning light across the orchids. at Seoul, going about its enormous indifferent business beyond the walls. And something settled in her face that had not been there before. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter. The particular ease of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not plan for and has decided without drama to stay. Park Myung-ja appeared in the garden doorway. Nobody had heard her come in, which was entirely consistent with her general approach to arriving places. She looked at the two of them at the table, looked at the document, looked at Zara's face, looked at her grandson's, then she walked to the orchids, inspected the one Mrs. O had been wrestling with, and said without turning around, "The south bed needs more drainage on the left side. You mentioned it last month and nothing has been done about it." "I'll fix it today," Zara said. "Good." The old woman touched one of the blooms lightly with one finger. "They've been better since you've been looking after them." She walked back inside without waiting for a response. Mrs. O, who had been standing beside the orchids trying to look as though she had not heard any of this, turned away so that no one would see her face doing what it was doing. Joon-Seo looked at the garden, then at the table, then at Zara, who was looking at the orchids with an expression he had never entirely seen on her face before, open in a way she usually kept in reserve. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Seoul went on outside the walls. The river moved. The city was loud and fast and absolutely indifferent, the way cities are. Park Myung-ja hosted a dinner 3 weeks after the garden morning. She planned the menu herself and gave explicit instructions that it contained no seafood, in any form including sauces, which was the kind of detail only someone paying very close attention would have thought to specify. When the staff presented the menu for approval, she reviewed it twice and sent it back once with a single line changed. They did not ask why. They simply made the adjustment, because that was how things worked when Park Myung-ja decided something was worth her attention. Zara arrived with Joon-Seo and sat across from the old woman through a dinner that was, for the first time in any gathering involving this family, something close to easy, not without friction entirely. Park Myung-ja was constitutionally incapable of an evening without at least 2 pointed observations, and Zara had by now accumulated enough context to meet them with the particular brand of respectful plainness that the old woman, Zara suspected, actually preferred to compliance. At one point near the end of the meal, Park Myung-ja said, without particular ceremony, "The orchids in the East Garden have been better this month. They needed the drainage changed. The soil was holding too much water on the south side." The old woman considered this. "How did you know?" "The color in the lower leaves. My grandmother would have known immediately." "I'm slower." Park Myung-ja was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was not warm exactly, because she was not a woman who did warm as a first language, but was something honest, she raised someone who pays attention. "That is worth something." Joon-Seo, besides Zara, did not say anything, but his hand under the table found hers. She let it stay there. Seoul went on outside. The river moved. The city was loud and fast and absolutely indifferent. But in this room, around this table, in this family that had made itself out of hard things and was still, improbably, making itself, something had settled into place that did not need to be announced or performed or explained to anyone. It was simply there, the way real things are, and just like that, a contract became a choice. A fake engagement became the safest place either of them had ever known. And the two people who were never supposed to matter to each other became everything. But tell me honestly, if you were Zara, would you have forgiven Tae-hyun? And at what moment did you realize Joon-Seo was already in love with her? If this story stayed with you even a little, subscribe to AfroSeoul Desires, leave a like, and drop your favorite scene in the comments. And when you're ready for another unforgettable story, your next one is already waiting for you on the screen.